Hey everybody, welcome to another multi-game My Thoughts On video, where I take a look at a few different games that I don't really have all that much to say about individually, so I bundle them all into the same video and talk about each one of them in turn. In this particular case, I decided to make the title a bit of a play on Hang 'em High, in this case it's Loot 'em High, because all three games that I'll be taking a look at in this particular video have random loot in them as a core mechanic, whether it should actually be there or not. So for this particular video, I'll be taking a look at Dungeons & Dragons Dark Alliance, Marvel's Avengers, and Outriders, and I'm going to go ahead and start with Dungeons & Dragons Dark Alliance. Dark Alliance is a co-op hack-and-slash loot-'em kind of game developed by Took Games and published by Wizards of the Coast in June of last year, and it was to a pretty negative reception overall. The game had a lot of technical problems on launch, and it was just generally an absolute mess to play it. Now, I didn't mess with the game on launch. I told myself, oh, it's having a bunch of technical problems, I'll just wait until they've sorted out at least the majority of those, and then I'll give the game a try. And then I promptly forgot about it until eventually I got a notification that it was going to be one of the games leaving the Xbox Game Pass thing, and so I decided to go ahead and give the game a try while it was still available on Game Pass, so if I ended up liking it, I could go ahead and buy the full game, and if I ended up not liking it, then I could just go ahead and do an MTO. Well, the funny thing about that is that I gave up on the game after exactly 1.5 missions, because that is how ludicrously boring this game is. Now, to give you some context, I haven't really messed around much with Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 1 and 2 yet. I do have copies of them, I just haven't really gotten around to them. But I can definitely tell you that they are certainly more interesting games than Dark Alliance is, because at least they are technically still single-player games, as opposed to basically Vermintide but without the hordes. You go into areas, you fight a bunch of enemies with a very simple, basic, button-mashy hack-and-slash system, and you have 4 characters that you can play as, with the only one anybody actually knows being Driz to Erden, and the loot system almost feels like it was just tacked onto the game as an excuse to have people grinding out missions. You end up with a similar problem to what you had in Vermintide, except that Vermintide at least had pretty relentless action because you had massive hordes of enemies coming after you, which at least made that feel like an actual Warhammer Fantasy game, as opposed to this, which feels absolutely nothing like Dungeons & Dragons. It just feels like a very generic co-op hack-and-slash game with the Dungeons & Dragons IP slapped onto it to try to make a quick buck off of the license alone. And even though I really haven't messed around much with the Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance games, I can certainly tell you it plays basically nothing like them, and those games are far more Dungeons & Dragons-like than this could ever hope to be in its current state. And of course, the loot and progression system falls into the same pit that Warhammer Vermintide did, where you have to level up each character individually, and you have to gear up each character individually, so if you want to try out a different character, you're starting from square one with the absolute baseline gear, and you have to basically grind out gear to get to the point where you're at an acceptable level compared to what you had been playing already, and that thus encourages you to only play as one character the entire time, which is a problem if you were trying to play it in co-op, because there's going to be certain characters that are going to be favorites of basically everyone. They're all going to want to play only that character, and as far as I'm aware, you can't have duplicates of the same character all in the same party, so you're going to have the matchmaking being an absolute mess, assuming you can even get enough people to start a match at all, because this game is apparently completely dead at this point. And frankly, that's not surprising at all. The initial reveal trailer of the game was absolutely terrible, and the follow-up trailers really didn't do much to inspire confidence either, and when the game finally came out, it was an absolute nightmare from a technical standpoint that was basically unplayable. So it left a very bad first impression, and even by the time they sorted out a lot of those technical issues, it didn't really matter anymore. This game is still a mess in terms of bugs and glitches and such. It's still a pathetically mediocre hack-and-slash game at absolute best, and it's just incredibly boring to play, so I really can't recommend it to anybody. And honestly, the game was such a big flop that I'm surprised they're even still keeping the servers running for it, so with Dungeons & Dragons being way more popular now than it has been in a very long time, they were pretty well primed to make a very popular game here, only they picked the hack and slash loot 'em up genre, which is really not a very good fit for Dungeons & Dragons, and they didn't put enough work in on the project, so it ended up being rushed and incomplete when it launched, and as such, you just get an absolute flop that is really no fun to play even after they've patched the game quite a bit and resolved several of the technical problems that made it basically unplayable at launch. It is technically playable now, but it commits the absolute worst sin a video game can commit, which is, it's just really boring. And as such, there is absolutely no reason to play it. The next game I'll be taking a look at here is Marvel's Avengers. This is the co-op beat-em-up game by Crystal Dynamics and Eidos Montreal that was published by Square Enix and released in 2020 to a very wimpy reception. And this particular section of the video is coming to you courtesy of Gamma12, who sent me a copy of this to take a look at, so thank you for that, it is greatly appreciated. Now, my first impressions for booting this game up and giving it a try were not good to begin with, although it was for just odd decisions that they had made. They start you off by having you play as Iron Man going through the tutorial sequence, and yet the game allows you to select any of the available Avengers to go on any of the missions that you have access to, which includes story missions and such like that. So, you only actually get a tutorial playing as Iron Man, and yet all of the characters have their own combos and their own special abilities that you need to be aware of. So I don't really know what they were thinking there on that design. It was just a very poor decision. It also didn't help that even on my SSD, this thing had surprisingly long load times. It did seem to clear up after the initial time I tried the game out, so I'm really not sure what happened there either. But before I go any further here, I do want to mention that this game was going in at a disadvantage to begin with. I am completely burned out on superhero stuff. There have just been way too many superhero movies and TV shows and such over the past several years, and I am just sick of them. Now, that's not to say that I won't watch them if I'm really bored, but I have to basically not have anything else to watch, and when it comes to superhero video games, I just can't really get excited for them right now. I mean, when you're burned out on superhero stuff in general from the ludicrous amount of movies, TV shows, etc. that are coming out, it's hard to get excited for games based on those things either, and Marvel's Avengers was no exception in that regard. Still, I hoped that I would at least be able to enjoy the game from a mechanical standpoint, and immediately the game just decided to say, no, you're not going to have fun. Because I started the game up and went through the tutorial sequence and then went to the war map. And just for the hell of it, I decided to switch my character over from Iron Man, who I didn't really enjoy from the tutorial, to the newest character introduced to the game, which is the Mighty Thor. Which you may think is weird because Thor was already in the game from launch day, except it's not actually Thor that I'm talking about. It's Jane Foster with the power of Thor. It's a tie-in with the upcoming Thor Love and Thunder, which I have absolutely no plans to see. And for all you comic fans out there, I know that there has been female Thor in the comics before, but honestly, I really don't care all that much. I don't really like Marvel comics very much. I've always been much more of a DC Comics guy. And even DC Comics I've really never been all that much into either, but that's beside the point. Regardless, it's a new character. I decided to give the new character a try just because it seemed different compared to what I had seen previously, which was just the characters who were available in the game on launch. I knew that they had released other characters since then, but I hadn't seen any gameplay footage with them or anything like that, so I was basically going into this blind with Jane Foster, who I didn't have a tutorial for, of course, because, you know, there's no tutorials for any of the characters except for Iron Man. Or if there are, then you have to go completely out of your way to find them, and I didn't care enough to do that, so there's that. But anyway, I went to the war table, and I just selected a mission that seemed doable with my gear score, which was basically nothing. And I went into the match, and found very quickly that the combat is horrendously unsatisfying. Because here's the thing. I know that Jane Foster is not Thor Odinson, but she has the power of Thor. She has Mjolnir. She has lightning attacks. She has tempest attacks. She can hit with some real authority. and yet it felt like every single one of my attacks had the impact of a stampeding chipmunk. I was just watching these health bars go down in very small amounts on enemies that didn't even seem like they were all that tough. It was just characters that were in maybe some basic armor with some basic guns, or some very basic robots that didn't really seem to pose much threat to the likes of the Avengers. And yet, here I was, barely doing any damage to these things. As, well, not Thor, but somebody with the power of Thor. It didn't make any sense. And then I got through that mission, and I got some gear, and bumped up my gear score, but then I decided to switch over to a different character. And at this point I said, you know what, I really don't feel much like a superhero or very powerful when playing as Mighty Thor, Jane Foster, whatever you want to call her, so let's go with a character I know is supposed to be super tough. Let's go with the Hulk. The Hulk smashes, that's just what he does. It should be awesome. And then I went into the mission, and it turns out he does even less damage than she did. I was just sitting there slack-jawed half the time going, what the hell am I playing? Why is this so boring? Why are you doing so little damage? Why do you not feel like a damn superhero in a superhero game? And I think most of that just comes down to the gear system. They tied your actual power with whatever gear you have equipped, which seems ridiculous for a superhero game. I mean, why should you care what equipment the Hulk can have? He's the damn Hulk! And yet, because of the way they've set this game up as a general looter game, you just can't feel like a powerful superhero, because every single thing just comes back to your gear score. If you don't have an appropriately high gear score, you're not going to feel like you're doing much of anything to the enemies you're fighting. It is just a completely ass-backwards way of handling power progression in a game like this. I can see things like, say, a leveling system where you gradually unlock new combos over time. I mean, hell, learning new combos and such over time has been a thing in action-adventure, hack-and-slash, beat-em-up kinds of games for a really long time, at least around 20 years. I definitely remember those kinds of games being a fairly common thing around the turn of the millennium. So honestly, that kind of thing really doesn't feel out of place in a game like this, and this does have a system like that. But it doesn't really affect your actual power level, it only affects what you can do. And all your actual damage output and damage resistance is handled by gear score, which is just really stupid. The whole game just reeks of corporate boardroom design. Like, they went into a boardroom with a bunch of executives and they were like, okay, we have the Marvel license, what can we do with it? Well, we have all these different options. No, you don't need to do those options. We need something that is just really popular right now that we can quickly and easily exploit. Well, what's that? Well, I guess looter games are a thing right now. Well, let's just copy-paste that into this game. But what about it not really making any sense? Who cares? Looter games are popular. Let's make one and just slap the Marvel license on it. It's all about player retention and addiction factors now. It's not about actually making a good video game with a good story and good gameplay. No, we can't do that anymore. That would actually make sense. Anyway, I ended up giving up on the game entirely after getting through that match as Captain America. I was just completely done with this piece of crap game, and I cannot recommend it to anybody. Even if you're a die-hard Marvel Comics fan, there is no reason to play this. It's just not a remotely fun game. The absolute best thing I can say about it is that at least it's functional as gaming software. It is playable. It runs halfway decently if you tweak your settings right. But the actual gameplay loop itself doesn't make you feel like a superhero at all and just ends up being insanely boring. So just avoid Marvel's Avengers entirely. And last for this particular video, we have Outriders, developed by People Can Fly and published by Square Enix on April 1st of last year. And while it was made available for PC, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, PS4, PS5, and apparently Stadia, what you're seeing here is of course the PC version, and more specifically, it was footage that I recorded when I messed around with this thing on a free weekend sort of thing that Steam was doing. Figured I'd give the game a try, and if I ended up liking it, I might end up buying it. Otherwise, I would just end up covering it in an MTO. Well, Obviously, you can tell from the fact that this is an MTO, I didn't really enjoy the game all that much. It wasn't terrible, but the few hours I ended up putting into the game weren't really enough to convince me to buy the game in full and continue on through the rest of it. So what exactly are we dealing with here? Well, it is a third-person, cover-based looter shooter. In that way, it's very similar to the likes of Tom Clancy's The Division 1 and 2. And while I would say the looter-shooter dynamic definitely works better in a sci-fi game like Outriders than a more modern military context like you have with something like The Division 1 and 2, the problem with Outriders is that it just doesn't really seem to know what it wants to be. At times it's trying to be deadly serious and grim and depressing, and then at other times people are cracking jokes out of nowhere, and it just feels like they can't really settle on a tone. And what I found very quickly is that the story is a bit of an incoherent mess that doesn't really do enough to keep your attention, so you end up having to focus almost exclusively on the gameplay mechanics. And the mechanics themselves are mostly fine, and the moment-to-moment, the combat itself, is a fairly engaging process. I mean, it is a cover-based shooter with some abilities that have cooldowns, and you have different class selections that give you different types of abilities. Now, what you see here, I was playing as a Technomancer, so the main abilities I was using were a sort of proximity mine that doubled as a grenade if you threw it close enough to enemies, as well as a turret that would auto-track and attack enemies to freeze them. And the third slot was for an ability that I ended up swapping out. It started out as a sort of multi-missile launcher, and I ended up swapping that out for one that turned into a rocket launcher if I pressed the button, and a minigun if I held down the button. And all that worked perfectly fine. Enemies were definitely bullet spongy, but that's the kind of thing you expect in a game like this. And the gunplay generally was relatively satisfying. It certainly wasn't the best I've ever seen or anything like that, and it being reliant on the loot system and the stat system means that, of course, it's just not going to be anywhere near as satisfying as a full-on first-person shooter or third-person shooter that doesn't have a loot system or stat system like this. But the real sticking point with all of this is just that not only was the story not really sufficient to keep me going throughout the entire thing, it's just that overall it wasn't really anything that I haven't seen before, and with nothing to really keep me going in it except for mechanics that I've already experienced in other games like, say, The Division 1 and 2, I just found myself shrugging more or less the entire time. It wasn't particularly bad, it wasn't particularly good, it's just a game that is playable and is competent enough to where there's not really anything egregiously wrong with it mechanically, but there's really nothing all that interesting about it either. I mean, like I said, the story is a convoluted mess that you just stop caring about almost instantly because it really doesn't make any sense. They don't really do anything all that interesting with the setting, even though it certainly had some potential. And since the game can't really decide whether it wants to be something more grimdark and serious, or whether it wants to be something a bit more lighthearted and action movie-esque, it's really difficult to get attached to any of the characters, so you have to go entirely off of the gameplay mechanics, which are just competent. Nothing particularly good, nothing particularly bad, just a playable game. And as such, I really can't recommend for or against the game all that much. It's just a matter of, well, if you like looter shooters, you might be able to get something out of it. But there's really not much staying power here, and even if you do have a group of friends to play it with, they're probably not going to be all that interested in it either after the first maybe 2 zones. There's just not enough stuff in the game to hold your interest long enough for it to be the kind of game that they have set out to make, which is one of those live service games where you just play it obsessively for a really long period of time. And the reality of it is, if you like looter shooters, you're probably sticking with one in particular and don't really want to play another one at this time until you have completely exhausted all of the interest you have in the one that you're currently playing. So honestly, I don't really know what they were thinking other than, well, maybe if we hook on to the popular looter shooter trend, we might be able to get some people interested in it. I mean, those people are probably already playing the likes of Destiny 2, or The Division 2, or Borderlands, or something along those lines, and really don't have much interest in Outriders. So I doubt we'll see the same kind of longevity out of this as we would with the likes of, say, Destiny 2 or The Division 2, considering those games have had quite a lot of content updates, and this one just now got its new World Slayer expansion, which does seem to have revitalized the player base a bit, but I don't really see it staying for very long. I guess we'll just have to wait and see, though. And, well, that wraps up everything I wanted to say about the 3 games I wanted to cover in this particular video. There are other looter-type games that I have that I'll be covering eventually in probably videos like this, but they tend more along the lines of Diablo clones, so I was thinking of doing an entire video of just a bunch of Diablo clones that I happen to have, which actually turns out to be quite a few games because I get a bunch of Humble Bundles and stuff, and for whatever reason they like to throw a Diablo clone or two into a bunch of those. So I've just ended up with a bunch of those over the years, and it's a bit annoying. Because, as it turns out, if you really don't get anything out of the addicting loot systems that they try to put into these games, the games themselves are never good enough to keep your interest throughout the entire thing. So most of the time I end up messing around with a Diablo clone, I'll only play it for maybe an hour or two before I just get bored and decide to stop playing it. So that kind of thing ends up being perfect fodder for videos like these. So I guess keep an eye out for stuff like that in the future. Unfortunately, there will not be an Independence Day review this year because I have just been sidetracked by all manner of other things, which is unfortunate. I normally like to do an Independence Day review every year, but this time I just didn't have the time or energy to. Certainly not with focusing primarily on Elden Ring right now. So hopefully that review will be out within the next couple of weeks, and I'll be able to free up the disk space that's currently being occupied by ludicrous amounts of gameplay footage, and be able to move on to other projects that are, frankly, a lot more interesting and enjoyable than Elden Ring is. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my content, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be things like getting games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. And it really does help out quite a bit, so I definitely appreciate your support through that as well. But even if you don't want to support the channel through Patreon, or you can't afford to, or whatever, that's fine. I understand. But thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.